The following is intended for mature audiences. In the course of debunking Richard Kuklinski's claims, we'll explaining the 5 murders he did commit. I'll also be discussing poison. I want to make it clear that this program in no way intends to promote suicide, self-harm, or homicide to you, me, or anybody else. I also want to make sure that everybody knows that kids should not be watching this. Kids, if you're watching this, get offline, go do something productive, like watch television or something. I'm happy, you're happy. Does everybody understand I want you all happy? Good. Then we can begin. The following is a 2-part documentary that's the first accurate documentary on Richard Kuklinski, a.k.a. the Iceman, that I'm aware of. It's less concerned with the specifics of his life than debunking his lies. I'm friends with a lot of people who would know, including Roy DeMeo detectives, a Kuklinski agent, and I know a lot more about Roy DeMeo and his crew than the vast majority of people ever will, because I've studied it very extensively. I've done journalism and talked to people who were involved with it or investigated it. And why? Because I'm writing a book on it. A new book on Roy DeMeo and the crew, as well as the police who went after him. And I know as much as anybody can know, Rich was not a mob hitman, especially for Roy DeMeo. I was able to figure this out without all these people, but they only confirmed it. I'm going to show you what they think during this 2-part series. Most people I know who follow my channel already know he wasn't a hitman, but this 2-part series should prove to you that he was not a Roy DeMeo hitman. Of course, some people aren't going to follow it carefully, and they're going to continue to believe whatever they want. But there's always this really fucking annoying question that gets asked, and it's a question that doesn't make any sense. Well, if he wasn't a mob hitman, well then how did he get all that money? Well, first of all, this question's always asked after I explain why Roy DeMeo did not pay people to kill for him, especially Roy DeMeo. And so that only makes it more annoying. However, if that's your evidence, I want to ask you, do you think Michael Jordan or Al Pacino or mob hitman? What about people you know who are wealthy but you don't know what they do? Does that mean that they're likely a mob hitman? Rich was a career criminal his whole life. He made his money bootlegging Super 8 and 8mm porn in Disney back when that was very lucrative. You didn't have VHS tapes, DVDs where you could easily record this stuff, and it was easy to sell. He also sold drugs, sold illegal guns, and he ran a burglary and car theft ring in that area where he was eventually arrested. They had a little black market thing going on there. And the first person to mention contract hit to Richard Kuklinski was Polifrone. He asked, hey, can you kill this Jewish coke dealer for me? And he wasn't trying to entrap him, he was trying to get him to talk to him. So that's the first time it's really even mentioned. Rich also didn't plan on actually doing that contract hit for Polifrone when he thought Polifrone was some thug. He was actually going to kill him and just take his money, which is what he did to half the people that he was convicted for of the 5 murders. In any event, the reason why I made this documentary, 1, I hate seeing bad people turned into anti-heroes and heroes, and I hate it when the media is rewarded for misinforming people after they learn the correct info. I want our true crime documentaries to be made in good faith and with as much accuracy as available, or at least try to make a hard effort. 2, ego. I wanted to be the first person to make an accurate Kuklinski documentary. 3, I was highly disturbed to see someone, even someone as seedy as Sammy the Bull, get framed by the media and its misinformation. By the way, I'm not anti-media automatically. I think it's stupid to automatically think that they're telling you the truth, but I also think it's stupid to automatically believe that they're lying. I just believe in fact-checking, and I'm not particularly partisan about it. Finally, I also saw merchandise online, such as a lighter that says from Richard Kuklinski to Roy DeMeo. That's fake, and this is going to cause people to lose a lot of money. Alright, the seller was like, well, you don't have to buy it if you don't want it. Why would I be writing you to tell you that it was a fake if I wanted to buy it? Obviously, not everybody only cares about themselves. Anyway, enough. Let's go. During the 1960s and through the 70s on, New York City was changing dramatically. Homicides, robberies, auto thefts, drugs, they're all out of control. Organized crime, well, it dominates New York City now. And more specifically, 5 Italian crime families dominate New York City. They're seizing control of everything: gambling, construction, sanitation, adult entertainment, and nearly anything else you can think of. Today, this era back then was so violent that it would seem like a dystopia to us, at least those of us who are living in the first 20 years of the 21st century. Now, there were other major changes happening, and to understand Richard Kuklinski and how he made a comfortable living by his 30s and 40s means you have to understand the era, and there were 2 major events that helped him make a lot of money. And these occurred during the 60s and 70s, and these events are largely forgotten. They also might explain what led to his homicides during the first part of the 80s, when society changed faster than he could adapt. What Richard was doing for a living isn't clear during the first 30 years of his life. What is clear is that by 1960, Richard was working for a trucking company, not as a driver, but in the warehouse where he would take boxes and carry various heavy items. So he worked basically unskilled labor. And that's where he met Barbara, his wife, or what would become his wife. She was 18, she was working as a secretary, and he sweet-talked and then eventually threatened to kill her until she agreed to become his girlfriend, and eventually they married. Now, it seems like a bizarre mating strategy and not conducive to a healthy relationship, but what the fuck do I know? She was defending this guy as a great husband until his HBO self-aggrandizing bullshit interviews of the 90s and 2000s, so she must have liked something about him. Romeo and Juliet, except Romeo stabs Juliet first. So he was working odd jobs the first part of his life, and maybe did some burglary. Around this time, Barbara identified him as somebody who was from the other side of the tracks, and there's nothing, as far as evidence goes, to suggest that Richard had a ton of money. He wasn't loaded. He would make a lot of money later, but I'm about to get to that. You see, to understand how Richard made his money, you have to understand the difference between the 60s through the 1970s and the decades that followed. He eventually got this job learning how to develop 8mm and Super 8mm footage, and this was before the internet, DVDs, or even VHS. You couldn't just easily record something back then. Guys developed footage in labs. Footage was shorter, quite short, until Super 8 was introduced in '65 by Kodak. Now this would last until VHS, but I'll get to that in a bit. So eventually, Richard learned the skills to become a lab technician and develop Super 8 films, and his income went up some. What paid really well back then was being a bootlegging film processor. Let's face it, crime pays. That 80s crime dog McGruff was lying to you. If you want to get rich fast and make more money than you might have ever even made doing it the right way, you break the law. And often you don't even have to be smart about it. You just have to be not too dumb while doing it. Now, breaking the law in order to be able to make money quick because you feel as if you just can't make it any other way, well, criminologists call this strain theory. Social pressures might persuade somebody to commit a crime to earn a bigger percent of the pie and get the American dream. Scarface in the following scene illustrates this perfectly.
Look at that punk with him. What's he got that I don't have?
Well, he's very handsome for one thing.
Of course, strain theory doesn't explain people who have opportunities who break the law, especially people at the top. But with Rich, who probably was committing crime at a young age and having come from an abusive background, well, breaking the law was probably no brainer to him. So when you're bootlegging illegal movies, you can either be stealing it from your boss or work for an illegal film company and process bootlegs for them. The latter was probably a lot easier since your boss is probably taking tally of his resources. And you could make the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, even as a worker. Paul Rothenberg made the modern equivalent of millions once he saved up enough and got his own lab with a partner. Kuklinski and Iceman, he claimed to work for Paul Rothenberg, but that's highly unlikely for reasons I'll explain later. But he did work for or had access to a lab and began bootlegging Disney films. It's kind of amusing thinking of the Iceman, Kuklinski, who murdered at least 5 people and had homicidal fantasies about feeding people to rats, selling Mickey Mouse, Bambi, and Snow White. I wonder if he ever sobbed when he saw Bambi's mom die, or if he whacked off to it when nobody was around. Of course, Rich wasn't just making money bootlegging Disney movies. There was a cash cow for him that was far bigger than even the mouse. And that brings me to another big change in society: porn. People's morals were relaxing a little bit. Now, porn has always been around, at least since there have been cameras, but never with the tolerance or even eager acceptance as during the golden age of porn, from the 60s to part of the 80s. Porn theaters, sex shops, strip clubs, and peep shows spread all over Times Square, which has now become the capital of sleaze and raunchiness. Prostitutes and pimps even begin congregating around there. Now, this was a great opportunity for Kuklinski to make a lot of money. He was going to sell bootleg porn and be awash in cash, and he did, and was very financially successful for bootlegging porn, 8mm and Super 8 films, to middlemen a lot of the times. They buy them in bulk for porn theaters and people who wanted porn personally for their collection, in tens of thousands of dollars. Now, Rich had grown up poor with awful clothes and a deteriorating house, so having wealth and an attractive place to live, a dwelling, and making sure people saw that his family wore nice belongings and clothes, and had nice belongings, of course, was important to Richard. He equated wealth and pretty belongings with success, and when he wasn't earning as much as before, he'd often start hitting himself hard, calling himself stupid, and scaring his family. He'd just feel like a total failure and would start striking himself. They were terrified that he was going to seriously hurt himself with those big arms and hands of his. Sure, Richard would almost kill his wife by beating the crap out of her, and he'd talk about murdering his family openly in front of them, presumably before committing suicide, but maybe not. Maybe that was just to get rid of them and then go on and do something else alone. And sometimes he'd even confide in one of his daughters that she'd be the hardest to kill. I'm sure that made her feel so much better. But none of that wasn't a parental failure. He wasn't failing as a father there so much as his inability to provide materialistic awards to impress other people. Richard had some very fucked up priorities. By 1980, Richard was more violent and unstable than ever. Something was making him either bolder in his crimes or more desperate for wealth. Something seemed to happen that made it harder for him to bootleg porn. Maybe organized crime drove him out. Maybe he'd been fired from that place that allowed him to film process and bootleg Super 8 films, particularly porn and Disney. And perhaps even the decline of the Super 8 for the VHS, because during the 80s they would become popular as a part of middle-class households, and just about everybody would own a VHS. But I don't think it was that, because Super 8 would still remain popular for years. So what was it? Who knows? For several years, 2 brothers, Donald and George Maliband, been buying Super 8 footage from Richard Kuklinski for thousands and thousands of dollars, and then selling them to popular adult entertainment venues, such as Bricktown's Plato's Retreat in New Jersey. In January 1980, George Maliband made a deal with Richard to buy Super 8 footage for $27,000. Now, since this is an illegal trade, it's technically $27,000 untaxed dollars, and that was out of money back then. Okay, done. Richard's happy about that. However, Richard didn't actually own any footage at this time for whatever reason, so he didn't plan on ever giving George Maliband those tapes that he was going to spend $27,000 on. No, he had another plan that was much more nefarious. In those last few days before George went to meet Richard, he His brother noticed something seemed off about Richard. He had never thought him dangerous before, but now he did. Donald didn't think he was the same guy that he was used to doing business with his brother, and he tried to warn George, but George didn't listen. And nevertheless, George went on January 31st to meet Richard and buy those tapes, and he was carrying $27,000 on him. George met Richard in a factory where he was shot several times in the chest. Then he was stuffed in a barrel and thrown down a hill near the factory. Richard then picked up the $27,000, probably in a briefcase, and took it. Now there's a documentary called I Live with a Killer, which defames and repeats Richard's lies about Maliband being killed because he was in debt to a loan shark. A former DA on it even called him a degenerate gambler. I think a degenerate gambler is just somebody who has a addiction that needs to be treated. I wouldn't call him a degenerate because of it, but there's no evidence he was a gambler either. Maliband was just there to buy porn reels. If he owed a loan shark something, he would not have come with $27,000 unless it was to pay off that loan shark.
George Maliband was a degenerate gambler, and he was into various loan sharks for gambling debts totaling about $35,000.
So Michael Vecchione taking the story straight out of The Iceman by Philip Carlo without fact-checking any of it. And it didn't take much to be able to find out that that's not what happened at all. So if he knows what he's talking about, and he's just making this up and going along with Philip Carlo, that makes him the degenerate. Now, let's see what the other guy has to say.
He actually went to Kuklinski for help, and when he was overextended, Kuklinski was able to get him a $35,000 loan from the Gambino crime family at the friend's rate of interest.
But Maliband soon stops making payments on the loan, and the Gambinos are not happy.
He's into the Gambinos now for the $35,000. So it was Kuklinski's reputation now on the line.
When the Gambino family starts leaning on Richard to sort out his friend's debt, Kuklinski invites Maliband to go for a drive to discuss the situation.
Maliband's cockiness got the better of him. When Richard Kuklinski told him that the Gambinos wanted their money, Maliband very foolishly told Kuklinski they were not going to hurt him because he knew where Barbara and the kids lived. It was the worst mistake he ever made. Kuklinski pulled over the car. He was shot 5 times right there and killed.
Yeah. Now it's possible that these two are completely misinformed and just are making a good faith mistake. But the other possibility is that these two are completely misinformed and just are making a good faith mistake. But the other possibility is that lying, I think they're corrupt and taking this money. Well, they're smearing a victim who was killed because Kuklinski just wanted to take $27,000, steal it from him when he was offering it for porno tapes that Kuklinski didn't have.
Today,
I shot George Maliband 5 times. Louis Masgay on July 1st, 1981. I shot him once in the back of the head.
When the judge asked him why he had killed the 2 men, Kuklinski replied,
It was due to business.
Wait, I thought it was because he threatened your family, not due to business. Fucking liar. Now it's time to move on to Richard Kuklinski's next kill. Next we have Louis Masgay. He owned a general store and he wanted to buy a lot of 8mm or Super 8mm footage, presumably porn, and presumably to resell it since nobody watches that much porn. So he met with Kuklinski at a diner and they had an agreement. He brought Kuklinski $95,000 in cash, which he'd kept in a panel in his van, and Kuklinski, well, he took him somewhere, and then rather than give him the footage, he shot him, stabbed him, and he put him in a freezer. And this is the only known victim that Richard Kuklinski froze. Anybody who said he freezes his victims doesn't know what he's talking about. He's only known to freeze one victim. And he kept that victim on ice for several years to confuse the police, which was a waste of time. He should have just dismembered him, got rid of him, and they still wouldn't have been able to figure out when he died. And then he took him out, left him for the animals to feed on, but people found ice crystals in him, so they knew he was frozen, that he was just released. So that wasted a bunch of time. So much for being a criminal mastermind. Again, could have just dismembered him. And Dr. Baden, well, he says he did too good a job. That just means he fucked up. So, that's Louis Mazgay. Motivation, steal $95,000 in a fake deal. Next, Richard Kuklinski runs across a guy named Paul Hoffman in '82. And Paul Hoffman's a pharmacist. They meet in the back of a store that's kind of a miniature black market. It's a store behind a store. And there they sell stolen goods. Now Hoffman's looking for a heartburn drug that's very popular at the time called Tagamet. He wants to purchase large amounts of it so that he can make a lot of money on it if he gets it cheap. Now since Tagamet isn't something people usually steal from homes, probably figured somebody might have shoplifted a bunch of it or hijacked a bunch of it from a chain store or a large pharmacy. There in that area behind the storefront, he meets Kuklinski. When he can't find the Tagamet, he's speaking to Kuklinski and he said, "Oh, don't worry, I can get it for you." And they agree to make an exchange. They're going to meet somewhere secret. Hoffman's going to give him $22,000 for the amount of Tagamet he wants. And so Hoffman goes to meet Kuklinski, and Kuklinski shoots him, takes the $25,000. Then he alleges he put Hoffman in a 55-gallon drum outside a motel and somebody just moved it and he doesn't know what happened to him after that. Either way, we know Hoffman's dead. Hoffman, he shouldn't have been buying stolen Tagamet or trying to, but it's not even like it was personal Tagamet. It was from a store brand. Probably didn't deserve death. So sometime between the mid to late 1970s and the early 80s, our lovable Polish psychopath found several different ways to earn. He was making money from buying illegal weapons and selling them, and also drug dealing. And he was also in charge of a very small auto theft operation and burglary ring. Now, auto theft rings during this era were a dime a dozen. Stealing cars was ubiquitous. It just wasn't punished very well. And you'd think if he had known Roy DeMeo, who ran the biggest auto theft ring in American history, he would have been working with him or connected to him in some way, and living in a mansion. But no, Richard just had a small number of mostly knuckleheads under his command, and the operation wasn't as sophisticated as many of the New York guys. Not just Roy, but other infamous car thieves during the 70s, such as Pete LaFrocia or the late John Quinn and Scorney, who were already murdered by this time. Now, Richard's guys included Gary Smith, Barbara Deppner, Daniel Deppner, and Percy House. And they were the type of guys who looked like somebody had dropped them as a baby, or they were products of incest or some kind of nuclear holocaust. They just didn't look like they were the smartest looking guys. But you know what? You can't always tell. In their cases, it seems like you could tell. At least they had their leader, Richard, who was quite intelligent. I'll give him that. He is above average, and we know we can trust Richard. Rich probably made more money from his burglary ring, which authorities were more concerned about during this period, than he did the auto theft ring. He and his guys had this racket where they were stealing from wealthy homes. Allegedly, during the process, somebody was killed, which would have been a felony murder charge for Rich, but maybe he had nothing to do with it. In any event, Daniel Deppner and Percy House were caught and arrested finally, and this was in the end of '82. Now, Percy decides he's going to testify against Richard as the mastermind, and he's going to snitch on the others. And Rich, well, he's horrified. This is December of '82, and he goes on the lam, and he takes his two cronies, Daniel Deppner and Gary Smith, with him. The three of them check into room 31 at a Bergen motel in New Jersey called the York Motel. Well, they're staying there for about a week. Gary Smith decides he's going to visit his daughter, and he also starts talking about going straight around these other two. So this made Rich and Deppner anxious. If this guy's going to squeal, like Percy House did. They decide he's got to go. So when Gary Smith gets back, Richard has some cyanide, and he laces his hamburger with it. And when Gary eats that hamburger, well, he doesn't immediately die, because Rich, the master poisoner, doesn't seem to know anything about poisons. He doesn't know anything about lethal dose measurements or time approximations. And as I show you in this video, cyanide doesn't kill you immediately. So when Gary doesn't immediately die like in the movies, Rich fucks everything up by having his mindless follower Deppner strangle Gary with a lamp cord. Well, that was really stupid. You see, cyanide would have been enough, and it would have eventually worked, and it's hard to detect. Constitution, which is what Rich thought the issue was, that Gary had a good constitution, well, that has nothing to do with it. You see, there are two types of poisons. Cyanide's very simple molecularly, and it will bypass your white blood cells. In any event, the cyanide would have killed Gary, and the symptoms are easy to miss. It causes red blotches. The ancient poisoner Lacosta used to call it cherry water because it will cause your skin to look a little bit cherry colored. But forensics, they're definitely going to catch a strangulation with lamp cord, even if they might have missed the cyanide. Next, these two ghouls left Smith's corpse between the mattress and the box spring in that hotel. If Rich was anywhere near as intelligent and methodical as he believes he is and as he purports in all of his stories, that he would have known how to properly dispose of the body, cut the body up in the bathroom and bagged it, and with the necessary methods, which I'm not going to go into right here, to make sure it wouldn't float up to the surface, go dispose of it in one of New Jersey's many bodies of water, bam, you'll never see it again. But since they had no imagination here, Smith's corpse was discovered by the 27th of December. It's like days later. Through an investigation, they're going to eventually be able to trace them to Kuklinski and Deppner. This guy was not a master criminal, I'm telling you. Well, at least Deppner wouldn't have to worry because by then he'd already be dead. It's late December, and Rich and his trashy thug yes-man Deppner, who's one of the original members of the Richard Kuklinski is Honest fan club, they decide they need a place to hide. And Rich remembers the guy that's engaged to one of his daughters, his name's Rich Christopher, they're both named Rich, is out of town, and Kuklinski knows where there's a spare key. So he'll leave his friend Deppner there, at least until Rich gets paranoid or irritated enough to get rid of Deppner too. And Deppner stays there. He's like, Rich would turn on everybody except me because I'm special. But these two were no Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or Frank and Jesse James. And later, Richie would start to think about it. Deppner's a liability. He could also squeal. Even if he's shown no signs of doing so and has shown nothing but loyalty. He gives Deppner some food because who wouldn't want to eat something from Rich after seeing him poison somebody else? And it's beans laced with cyanide. And just to be sure, and just because Rich never learns, he also strangles Deppner. He then contacts Patterson, said this guy, somebody broke in and killed him. It's the stupidest story of all time. He said, we got to dispose of the body. It's only getting more stupid as a story, but whatever. Patterson, for some reason, goes along with it. And they dump the body where cyclists can find it very easily in a wooded area. A bunch of vultures were gnawing on it. And on top of that, he goes and he tells a friend of his that he murdered Deppner because he just cannot keep his mouth shut. Only in this case, he was telling the truth. And months go by, and Rich makes his final kill on September 25, 1983, and that's Louis Mazgay. Now, he wants to buy some video cassette recorder tapes. VCRs are getting big, probably porn. He has $95,000 for this. He says he'll bring it in cash. He keeps it in his van. This is a store owner. Rich meets him, shoots him. Nothing particularly impressive about what he does. No funny quotes. And he stores his body in a freezer. That's how he gets the name Iceman. Cops are starting to figure things out. It's come to the attention of a guy named Pat Kane, an officer from New Jersey. He's decided he's built a file, and he's decided that he's going to get a large operation together. He's going to bring in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms because of guns being involved. It's titled Operation Iceman. And that's where the hero cop, Dominic Polifroni, a friend of mine whom I admire a lot, I consider him a definite hero, he becomes involved. An 18-month operation to arrest this giant homicidal Pollock. Now I want to make it clear, obviously from what everything I've just described tells you, Richard Kuklinski was extremely dangerous and extremely serious and extremely mentally unbalanced and a total psychopath and a sociopath. A little bit of both. However, what I dispute is everything else. This is enough to be able to make somebody extremely dangerous. Most people, they can't get away with one murder. So he's showing intelligence and being a very effective killer. You don't have to believe he killed 100, 200 people or was a mob hitman. Being this dangerous still makes him absolutely fascinating. And certainly doesn't take away from the work of the police agents who took him down. This guy was going to keep killing. Now, this video is running longer than I anticipated, and my main focus these days is my DeMeo book and my DeMeo series. And this series is not concerned with the specifics of Rich's personality in life, but rather what's bullshit and what happened in a broad sense. So I'm going to skim the next parts. Operation Iceman occurs, and it's going to occur for 17 months before they nab this guy. Everyone knows Rich is dangerous, but by now they just can't get close to him. Rich doesn't seem interested in talking to anyone. He's very anxious and paranoid. Knows Barbara Deppner and Percy House are out there snitching on him, and he spends most of his time alone carousing a black market in the back of a store. Polifrone, he goes undercover. First, they almost don't give him the job as approaching Kuklinski because Polifrone, I know him, he's a very nice guy, and he comes across as nice. I don't know how anybody couldn't see this guy as a nice guy and a cop, except Richard Kuklinski. But anyway, he calls himself Pavarzoni, I believe it's called. I'm terrible about butchering my Italian names, even though I'm part Italian. And he says he's a mobster to make Rich feel less anxious about being snitched on. Kane and Polifrone, they work with one of Rich's only friends left, Phil Solimina. And the reason why he's willing to work with the cops is because he knows Rich is run off the deep end. He's just gone nuts. Eventually, Rich is finally properly introduced to Polifrone under his undercover name. And Rich, well, he immediately starts blabbering away. He immediately rants on himself in every way possible about his murders, about putting cyanide on burgers, about how great he is, how tough he is, and everything else he's done illegally. Now, since Rich has run out of cyanide at this point, because he didn't know how to give precise lethal amounts and overused it, probably also murdered Pronge, that guy was a real person, mention him later, had chemistry knowledge, well, now he doesn't know how to replace it. So he asked Polifrone for pure cyanide, whatever that is. I don't think it needs to be pure, whatever, because it's simple, molecularly, so it's not really about being pure, and it'll kill you, but pure sounds good, to Kuklinski anyway. Polifrone says, yeah, he can get it, and he also buys an illegal gun and murder kit from Kuklinski, just basic stuff, and he asks Kuklinski if he will be a contract killer for him. Now, no, Kuklinski probably hasn't been a contract killer at this point before, but yeah, he's happy to kill somebody for Polifrone, although he probably doesn't really plan on doing it. He plans on just getting money and whatever he can, cyanide from Polifrone, and just killing him. Polifrone says he needs a Jewish cocaine dealer murdered. And at this point, authorities are assuming correctly Kuklinski plans on killing Polifrone because he's blabbering away. They're correct about the planning on killing part. I don't think that Kuklinski was blabbering away because he planned on killing Polifrone, because Polifrone could snitch on him at any time in between. I think that at this point, it was really about Rich just being a narcissist. I think he was lonely because he murdered off pretty much all his friends and probably had trouble connecting to begin with. Psychopaths and severe sociopaths oftentimes have trouble bonding. It goes to this mask of sanity concept, which I talk about in my DeMeo series. And he had poor impulse control, so he just wanted to blabber away and bond. Of course, he did so to the most obvious nice guy and cop in the world to me, and Polifrone's a very nice guy. I can't believe, only Richard would not notice this guy's a cop. So now Polifrone's getting what he wants. And they're going to meet up, and he's going to give him fake cyanide so that he can have that, because he wants to kill two snitches, Barbara Deppner, Percy House. And all the while, Polifrone, he's got a gun in his boot. He's ready if this guy tries anything. A lot of people are like, oh, he would have torn Polifrone apart. I'm not even sure if he would beat Polifrone in a fight necessarily. If you see his photo, he's a pretty serious-looking guy in that. Your size doesn't always mean that you're going to win, and I don't know necessarily that Kuklinski could even fight. I bet you Polifrone could, though. And it's not going to come down to a fight anyway. It's going to come down to guns. And I bet you Polifrone's better trained. But in the event, Richard receives the fake cyanide. He tests it on a dog. The dog doesn't do anything. It's like, okay, he's in trouble. And when he goes home, Police are waiting for him. 5 guys jump on top of him. Very strong. They handcuff him, and he goes to prison. Of course, his wife goes out there. She gets arrested for trying to interfere. She just thinks he's the greatest husband in the world when he's not beating the hell out of her and threatening to murder her. And threatening to murder her kids, too. She always said she would have killed him if he laid a hand on his kids. I don't know that he didn't, but even if he didn't, I don't believe for a second he was intimidated by her or that she would have done anything. If she would have done something, she would have done it already because he had threatened to kill his kids for a long time. So it goes to trial. Richard starts confessing, and once it gets to the point where he's got life, it's over for him. He's fine with confessing. And once he gets to prison, after a while he finds it's not that bad. I think there was a lot of stress on him out in the outside world. But it gets even better for him. First, he likes all the attention from the news media he got. And he starts admitting to the most outlandish things. They call him a contract killer on TV because he had offered to contract himself out after Pronge said, "Will you do that for me?" So it's not like he was thinking about that until he came upon Pronge. So he calls himself he likes that idea. He starts claiming absurd things like he had a death spray, which I'm going to debunk soon. All these other things. That's not enough. HBO, he starts claiming that there were people he didn't murder, so he wants more attention. He enjoys prison, but he also enjoys the attention. So HBO, they hear about it. At first they believe him, and we could solve some murders here, and this guy's fascinating. They come in, they do their special in '92. They keep drawing on this guy. Anthony Bruno does his book. It's all done in good faith. Eventually, Richard pulls the rug out from under him, in Pronge's own words. They're like, well, this is big money. So they keep going along with it, and there's a special part 2 and 3. And if you notice all the experts in it, they never actually say, except for that psychiatrist in the third one, I'm sorry, but doesn't know what he's talking about other than the forensic psychiatry field. He doesn't know anything about contract killers or any of that. But in any event, most of the people who were actually involved in Kuklinski's case, they don't ever claim he's a contract killer. They're just going along with it like, yeah, he's the most dangerous guy. He killed, 5 people by this, and this. And Pronge, well, he disputes what Rich is claiming for a while, but, he is making a lot of money off this. And so after a while, he's like, okay, I'm not going to lie necessarily, once he starts to realize this guy's just lying about everything, but he'll still go on the circuit and make money and just won't really address that part of it because people want to hear that he was a contract killer. It's just so exciting to him. Meanwhile, DeMeo's story is 100 times more interesting and unbelievable, even though he didn't make it up like Rich did. Rich probably didn't know DeMeo, as you've seen now. And I would have loved to have seen the expression on Roy's face if he knew Rich was making up all this about him. So we have these 3 HBO interviews. I'm going to debunk all his major claims, and I'm going to show you informants, mobsters, ex-DeMeo crew members, one of which I know, and who say this guy had nothing to do with the mob. Now, since we can't time travel back to these events like we can in my DeMeo series, simply because Rich's depiction of his own past is more like Fantasia than his actual history, I'll have to rely on what we can confirm and what he said in his interviews that was probably true. Richard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935. That's straight from Wikipedia, but however dubious you might find that source, it's also supported by other solid sources. So, first we reach Richard's childhood. Wait, is that fucking kid on a pony or a horse? Do you know how badly as a kid I wanted a pony or a horse? You fucking spoiled bastard. Child abuse my ass. I'd have taken a daily paddle up the ass for one of those. Let me guess. You were actually born Richie Rich, not Big Rich. That's the troll surprise here, isn't it? Your dad better have buggered you with a steel-toed boot up the ass. I'm going to unbury your corpse and piss on it, you spoiled fucking lying brat. Oh, I kid. I'm just kidding. I'm sure he had it bad. Everybody quit being so serious. The subject is dark enough as it is. You guys like being trolled by him. Can I troll you a little bit? Anyway, back to the serious shit. So, First, we reach Richard's childhood, where he speaks about it, and this is where he seems the most authentic. He even seems to let his guard down and soften. This is also where I can actually relate to his fans on feeling sad for Rich, and I forget for a moment what a jerk he was. And so we're clear, I have a love-hate relationship with Rich. It's not just a hate relationship. He really pisses me off, but I also can feel bad for him at times, too, when I hear about his past. He's a sick man, but I could appreciate some of his qualities, I observed. And I would have liked to have met him, but I would have been more inquisitive and tried to catch him up and stuff like that. I wouldn't have just listened to his bullshit. Would have tried to unlock him. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he was an abused kid by the way he behaves and the way his brother behaved. The fact that they were both so sick, I'm sure that he was an abused kid even by the standards of abused kids. And I'm sure Stanley, his dad, was physically and emotionally abusive, and his religious fundamentalist mom was cold and abusive too. I believe him on all that. I mean, he called her cancer, and he basically was pleased when his dad died. Now, there are a few parts of his childhood that Rich talks about that are worth doubting. Did his dad really beat his older brother to death when he was still a child? Or did that boy fall down the stairs like his parents claimed? Well, either situation seems equally plausible, since Rich could be mistaken because he didn't like his parents and he felt like they were violent, and he might have just come to that conclusion without factual evidence. Or he also might have embellished his brother's death and said that the kid was killed for more sympathy from the public. Obviously, there are plenty of kids that are out there that get abused until they get hit one too many times by their dad or even their mom. And his dad was obviously an angry sadist, so either situation wouldn't surprise me. In any event, I think Rich probably did feel like his dad murdered his brother with all the beatings that were going on, so I'll say that at the very least, Rich believed it was true. Now, Rich also discusses torturing animals, and Rich definitely tortured and killed animals. I don't know if he did it to the degree that he did with examples that he gave. Putting one in a furnace, was in his public apartment building when he was a kid. Apparently that was supposed to be hard to get into, and there was probably a high risk of him being caught, but it wouldn't surprise me. What we do know is that he murdered his daughter's dog simply because he didn't want her going out. The one example, though, that's ridiculous is the one where he ties the cats up. You probably can't string two cats' tails together and hang them on a line like that. It seems anatomically impossible. And they'd be in too much pain, screeching, and desperate, that they probably wouldn't start fighting. I don't believe that for a moment. I do believe his parents were monsters, and that's because Rich was screwed up, but perhaps the biggest indicator is Joseph Kuklinski. If there's somebody that's even more evil and a morally offensive person than Rich, it seems like it was Rich's brother, Joseph Kuklinski. Now, Joseph was born 9 years after Big Rich. So in 1970, Joseph Kuklinski decides to let the world know what a big piece of shit he is by abducting this poor 12-year-old girl, Pamela's dog. Pamela spent the night shouting for her dog, terrified of losing the poor pet, and then she finds Joseph. He approaches her and he said, "Hey, I know where that dog is." And since the girl was innocent, trusting, she is 12, she follows Joseph to a roof. There he rapes and murders her, and then when he's done, he takes her corpse, throws it off the building, 5 stories down to concrete. And he picks up the dog that's barking and throws the dog off the roof. Miraculously, the dog survived. And it keeps barking. It's upset, it's in pain, and it's angry, and it alerts other people and authorities. It was a little hero dog, and it avenged its owner. And that dog probably also saved other future kids, because that kind of disgusting, horrific behavior, well, it indicates somebody who is either a child serial killer or will kill more kids. You don't usually see just a person say, "Hey, I'm gonna go rape and murder a child someday," and then stop right there. Good dog. Brings attention to Joseph. He's arrested. He's sentenced to life in prison. I would have preferred to sentence him to a isolated forest where I could fire a .45 at his testicles. But okay, we'll go with life in Trenton. And he never gets out. Coincidentally, it's the same prison that Rich would be sentenced to 16 years later. And after Rich arrives and he sees his brother, they serve the next 20 years in the same prison. Richard Kuklinski never liked or respected his brother, and he said that he was disgusted by what his brother did to that daughter. I don't know how much he cared or not. I can't say. Richard was also so screwed up. I will say this. I take it back. Richard Kuklinski can have his childhood pony. I'd rather just not be related to his brother or his dad. Now it's time to move on to the less depressing stuff, and on to Richard's lies, which he made in prison once he got an audience, and he had Hollywood and the rest of the media. Now I'm going to start very carefully in order. We'll start with his early murders. He claims that he murdered somebody when he was a kid. Then I'm going to go on and talk about the other parts of his childhood and some of his early kills that he claimed. Then I'm going to talk about his claim that he was a hitman, starting with the DeCalvacanti family. They're the New Jersey crime family. So I'm going to talk about his claim of joining them. Then I'm going to discuss his rat hits and his cyanide hits and why those are absurd. And I'm going to go back and talk about his claim that he worked for Roy DeMeo and the Gambinos, and then the rest of the show will finish with debunking his famous hits. Now, this man murdered between 5 and 6 guys. Polifroni, I know him, he said on the phone, maybe 10. But none of those were mob-related. Even Polifroni agrees with that. And I don't know where he's getting the others, but he's the guy who arrested him, so he might know something I don't. I don't know. So let's start with Richard's early life and what he has to say about that, such as the bullies and how he fought back. It's better to give than to receive, he would sneer. And let's in particular talk about Richard's first murder, which he committed 3 times. If that doesn't make any sense, we'll in a moment, because liars aren't consistent a lot of the time.
When his father abandoned the family, Richard, a skinny, timid young teenager, was left to fend for himself. He was an easy target for street gangs.
So according to Richard, when he was a teenager, he was tormented by a gang of bullies. These bullies had a hard-on for large Polish kids. Finally, Richard decided he wasn't taking it anymore. No more of their bullshit.
When I was a young man, I found out that if you hurt somebody, they'll leave you alone.
He was tearing his shirt off to reveal the cat-hating, homicidal, anti-hero Richard Kuklinski that millions would someday come to know and adore.
But by the time he was 16, things began to change.
Well, it was 16 in the HBO special in '92, but later Richard decided it was 13 when this happened. And that's what he told Philip, Carlo, and Anthony Bruno. But hey, maybe it was just a detail he forgot or HBO screwed up on, who knows. 13 sounds more accurate. That's the age that most supervillains suddenly become superhuman.
Until one day I just decided, well, I've had enough of this picking. And I went upstairs and I took a bar, which the clothes used to hang on in the closet. And I went back downstairs and there were like 6 young men still figuring they were gonna mess with my head, and we went to war. To their surprise, I was no longer taking the beating. I was giving it. And that's when I learned that it was better to give than to receive.
3 years later, Richard would realize that his earlier story wasn't quite accurate, and while conducting an interview with Anthony Bruno, would tell him the real story. There had been a gang leader, and his name was Johnny, a no-good project thug. And he really was the one that was leading this gang to bother poor little Kuklinski. No matter what and where Richard ran, Johnny and his gang would pursue him and just knock him around.
How about a front kick, Johnny?
Now, all the neighbors thought that Johnny was a good boy. After all, what good boy wouldn't chase around a kid all the time and torture him? And finally, our murdering, conniving psychopath with a heart of gold and a need to tell the truth about himself decided he wasn't going to take it anymore.
Get him up. Leave him alone, man. He's had enough.
Instead, this time, he got a stick or a cudgel rather than that metal bar and waited for Johnny in the courtyard. This is the first time he's fighting back against this gang, but this time he's also focused on the leader. The other gang aren't around at this time. So it's dark, and he's in the courtyard of these dilapidated project buildings where he lives. Johnny spots Rich, and Where our evil hero stands, he's squeezing his cudgel in the dark. And he's ready to make a piñata out of his enemy's skull now. Johnny puffs on his cigarette. He's all cool. Johnny, however, doesn't realize that Richie's looking at him like Michael Myers, and he decides to engage in your usual cliched bully banter. And he sneers, "What the hell you doing out here, Pollock? You looking for trouble or what?" But Richie doesn't respond. He knows what he has to do. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Pollock. I ask you, what do you think you're doing out here?" "Answer me, Pollock, or I'll kick your fucking teeth in." Richie now, though. The new Richie. He lifts his cudgel. Suddenly Johnny looks uneasy. "What the fuck are you going to do with that? What, are you going to play stickball out here, Pollock?" And when Johnny reaches to seize that pole that he's holding, that's when the new Richie kicks in. "Oh my God, no, stop! Stop! No, stop!" Johnny shrieks. Now, allegedly, this is when he committed his first murder. Richie wailed away with a stick at the terrified Johnny until he knocked him down, and he kept hitting him and kept hitting him, right next to the wall of an incinerator building. Then, finally, in the dark, he leaves Johnny sprawled out prone, probably unconscious. So, Rich swings around and trudges back to his apartment, feeling empowered. The next day, Richie finds out that Johnny was dead, but they never catch him for it, thankfully. According to Bruno, interviewing Iceman, that was Richard's first known murder.
Kuklinski's reputation as a tough guy with a hair-trigger temper grew. By the time he was 18, the abused had become the abuser. It wasn't long before he committed his first murder.
I got into a fight in a bar. We got into an argument, a fight. And I hit him with a cue stick. A few too many times. And he died.
Well, somebody must have mixed all that up, because we know if there's a discrepancy in Richard's stories, it's got to be the other people who are making shit up, not Richard. He had a record of honesty and integrity. Unfortunately, we wouldn't get the real story until 2006 with Philip Karl, and that's when Richard finally remembered it. He remembered everything. Rich then remembered that the gang leader that was his first kill when he was 13 wasn't Johnny. That sounded too 80s yuppie bully anyway. His actual name was Charlie Lane, and he died quite differently. Iceman must have been distracted when talking to Bruno, or maybe Bruno was just lying. It comes down to Bruno's honesty versus Iceman. We know it's Iceman who's honest. So here's what really happened. This guy, Charlie Lane, he's beating Richard up, and he's leading a gang, and they're beating him up, and they're really beating him up this time. They're hitting him with anything they can. And Richard decides he's not taking any more of Charlie's bullshit, or his gang. He's decided he's going to confront Charlie in that same area next to the incinerator. At least somebody translated that part correctly. Now, Charlie looks differently than Johnny had. Apparently Anthony Bruno even got that wrong. Johnny was more normal looking, but now Charlie looks like a dumb, strong ape. I like this new version of Johnny, even if it's not really Johnny, it's Charlie Lane. Charlie Lane sounds like more of a 1940s and 50s thug anyway. He pulls his pole off a dolly this time, and he hides it in the sleeve of his peacoat. And this time he's not going to show it to the bully. That didn't actually happen. Bruno got that one wrong too. So he goes out and he sees Charlie Lane approaching. It's daylight again, snowy. And Charlie Lane says, "What the fuck do you want, Pollock? Get the fuck out of my way or I'll give you another beating, you dumb fucking Pollock." But this time, Rich doesn't stay mute. He's going to fight for his ethnicity. "Yeah, try." Well, as Charlie the ogre bully approached, that's when Rich yanked the pole out of his sleeve and beats Charlie to death. But this time, realizing it's daylight, He has to pick Charlie up. He puts him in his car, and he drives out in the middle of nowhere on a bridge above a small pond. Rich then notices there's a hatchet in the trunk, which is convenient, and so he cuts off Charlie's fingers and shatters his teeth to make it harder to identify the corpse. He's going to later, while he's driving, throw those pieces everywhere so that the birds will eat it. I mean, it's not like anybody might accidentally find that. But then he had, after knocking out the teeth and cutting off the fingertips, picked Charlie up and thrown him over into that lake. Oh, that fixed everything. Of course, as Jimmy Coonan in real life actually learned, which can be confirmed, and which I discuss in my Westies video, unless you puncture the lungs of the body, it'll eventually surface again because there's too much air in it. And it can stay afloat for over a month, I think a couple months. It took a while for them to find Ruby Stein, whose torso was floating out in the middle of nowhere in the Hudson, which just wouldn't sink yet. So that would have been well after the winter ice melted. But that's okay because nobody ever noticed Charlie anyway. Maybe nobody ever comes down to that lake. You know, Richard's the only one who comes there. But even if they had found that torso, they wouldn't have been able to identify him. In fact, the authorities tried to identify him when Richard told his story, and they could never find evidence of a Johnny or Charlie or Project Boys at all during that period. You can go to old news articles and look at missing people. No Charlie Lane anyway. And if you do a news search from that time period, you won't find him either. But I blame the incompetent cops and the incompetent news and anybody else alive in the area who should have remembered. They're all liars. Because our noble psychopath, Richard, wouldn't troll people and just make things up. He's too honest for that. Now, Philip Karl, we need to make clear, is a top crime writer and historian. He fact-checks everything. Well, other than misquoting Dominic Polifroni saying that Kuklinski killed 200 people. Dominic, whom I know, by the way, never said that. He said maybe 5 to 11. But oh well. Even if Karl really isn't a fact-checker, we know we can trust Kuklinski merely on his word like HBO did, because antisocial personality disorders, who also happen to be very narcissistic and insecure, don't tend to lie. Do they? The poor son of a bitch who burned alive because Richard threw some gasoline into his car is one that Richard claimed to be his second murder. Now, the cops never found evidence this actually happened, and he was never charged for burning somebody alive. But Richard asserted it was his second murder. Now, HBO, they show you evidence that this actually happened with a headline in the news from New Jersey City that shows you that a man was burned alive. Now, remember, HBO's priority isn't educating you. Its first priority is making money by entertaining you.
One night in a bar, a loudmouth made the mistake of insulting the 18-year-old Kuklinski in front of people.
The irony with this is, if there was anybody on the planet who was ever a loudmouth, it was this asshole, Richard Kuklinski, who does nothing but bombastically brag and act like he's the toughest guy on the planet or who ever lived. Well, HBO kisses his ass for money. But let's continue.
A couple of hours later, the Iceman saw his chance to get even.
I come out of this bar.
Wait, pause. Don't worry. I'll start it over for him. I'm at a disadvantage here. You see, HBO determined to sell Iceman as the most dangerous thing of all time, while juxtaposing it with his tragic life, plays creepy music to enhance his charisma. Maybe this'll work? I don't know.
I see him sleeping in his car. It's like, I should have a sucker now. I got you. I'm going to light you a fire. And I did. I got myself a bottle, some gasoline, and I threw it in the car with him.
So when Rich elaborates further on page 32 of Philip Karl, this loudmouth insults Rich by calling him a cheater, a pool, and then a dumb Pollock, a frequent insult in the book because everybody seems to know Richard's ethnicity, and they all hate Pollocks for some reason. All right, okay. So he burns this guy alive while sleeping in his car and casually walks away. Nobody comes outside to the screens and notices the 6'5" Pollock walking casually away like in a Hollywood film. It's weird, but okay. Cops could never actually find evidence this happened, as I showed you earlier. But HBO could. They show you a headline while it's happening. It happened at Club International in New Jersey City. These cops must be dumb. Except, wait a second. The book says it happened at a bar named Danny's. That's not the same bar. So, the HBO guys, they must have been just showing you a bullshit headline. Because Richard Kuklinski contradicted himself and said, no, it wasn't that place. It was this bar where nobody could find this event ever happening. I have a feeling you wouldn't be able to find the bar either if you looked that it never existed. But even if it did, there was no evidence that he ever killed anybody there. The cops weren't able to find any, if they even found evidence of that bar existing. Next, Richie allegedly leads a gang called the Coming Up Roses. They terrorized New Jersey with their bats and gun and brawling, and they're the most dangerous gang around, all the while completely eluding even slight media attention. But they did gain mob attention, allegedly. The DeCavalcanti mob family, otherwise known as the New Jersey crime family. They're basically the Sopranos. They have the power and position and location of the Sopranos on television. Sopranos obviously being fictional. And specifically, Rich and his gang gained the attention of a guy named Carmine Genovese. Now, this Carmine Genovese, who there's no evidence ever existed, is supposed to be a boss with the New Jersey crime family, either a soldier or a capo. But you can tell Richard made him up entirely. There's no evidence, of course, that the figure ever existed. Couldn't find anything in any papers anywhere. And he's written like some kind of comical Italian stereotype of a mobster. This is where Rich could have used a creative writing instructor to fix these things. However outlandish, I don't think he was a terrible storyteller. But yeah, they call this guy Carmine the Meatball. Now, Carmine decides he's going to hire Roy and his 18-year-old punk friends in his Coming Up Roses gang as contract killers. This is ridiculous because the mob had their own men to do kills. In the mob, there are killers and there are earners, and sometimes both killers and earners. The killers who can't earn have to earn their place somehow, and so they do so by killing. And they do it for free, since they are given lucrative rackets in return to manage with the expectation of at least not completely fucking it up. Now, the exceptions would be Burke and Roy. They use outsiders, but they still had to be inner members of their crew. So Carmine the Meatball would have no reason to trust a bunch of kids to keep their mouths shut, not tell the cops if they screw up or flip. And it's important to remember that if they don't kill this enemy effectively, and they have no training, then if the enemy learns that someone just tried to kill him, he's liable to, at best, flee, try to hit back, or become an informant. So Richard's story of how he and a bunch of kids became top hitmen over this fictional Meatball's own crew should be more proficient at killing and more experienced at it. That sounds like a bunch of nonsense. One of the first things Richard needed help with when he thought up these stories was the dialogue. So they come in, they're invited to Carmine Genovese, the Meatball's home. He's a little short, round guy with a round head that looks like a meatball, I'm assuming. And he's making meat gravy sauce. Because why would the meatball make something whose recipe doesn't emphasize meat? Duh. And this is his dialogue. I'm hearing all the time about you, and I like what I hear. I got a piece of work for you. You do this good, I'll make sure you earn big. This guy in Lincoln Park, here's his address and his picture. He's a problem. He's got his head up his ass. He's got to go. You do a good job, I make sure you earn. Capiche? Every Italian that he meets says capiche. I did everything for you already. Just finish the work. He's got to go. Understand? Yeah, absolutely, Richard said. Good. Just got to happen quick. Understand? Anything goes wrong, you call me. We own the cops here, okay? Honestly, that's a little bit overblown. The mob never completely owned a whole precinct of cops. Roy had 5 on his list of rogue cops. It was usually a lot more complicated than that. They were good cops, and then they had some bad rogue cops within them. So off the Coming of Roses go. And of course, the guy who was supposed to shoot the target, he can't do it. He's just not strong-willed enough. So Richard takes over, and he easily shoots him. Because basically this whole book is Richard sucking himself off. And everybody looks in awe when he just easily shoots this guy, and they're like, cool as a fucking cucumber. Man, you're cold like ice. Even though that's a little coincidental because his Iceman name wouldn't come about for like another 35 years.
Genovese graduates the young Kuklinski from theft to murder.
In the book, Genovese, the meatball boss, first asked Kuklinski immediately murder, but that seemed too far-fetched. So one of the ways you know this I Live with a Killer documentary isn't really a documentary, but just a money grab, acting in bad faith, is it says he stole for the meatball boss first and then graduated him to murder, because that sounds more convincing. So they return to the meatball boss, who's impressed, and he should be, as well as he should be impressed with himself, because he stupidly just had a bunch of kids go and do this. Yeah, kids don't talk. Bravo, you son of a bitches! Yeah, this is great literature. Very convincing. So he starts giving the crew, should I say the gang of punks that he's just found, a lot of work rather than giving that work to his own men. And they start hijacking, and they manage during their hijacking to steal $2 million in gold and money. $1 million goes to their boss, and they split up $200,000 apiece. Now that story's a little fishy. Wow, Rich, you were only 19, and in 1954, you and a gang of your stooges managed the 3rd biggest hijacking in American history at that point? $2 million? And nobody even knows about it? That's how good you were? It isn't listed in any news articles. You don't tell lies, because you seem so fucking honest. I mean, when do profit, narcissistic, attention-starved serial killers lie? Later, our meatball boss orders Rich to do a hit on another boss. At a young age still, he's like in his early 20s, all by himself, confident Rich will be able to get through his bodyguards, because Rich is somehow almost supernatural. And our meatball boss also knows that these guys will retaliate if Rich fails, but of course Rich isn't going to fail because he's the Punisher times 2. Rich can't fail. And if you're a 2nd grader, this should start to sound far-fetched. So Rich gets through the bodyguards, and he kills the nephew as well of this other boss who's not named because he's not real, as part of the mob hit. Now, you're not supposed to kill extra people if you don't have to, just the hit itself, but mob rules don't apply when it comes to Rich. After all, he's the one telling the story. In addition, since Meatball Boss had another boss whacked, that means he must at least be a capo, and they were usually documented because there weren't that many of them. But for some reason, this guy's not documented maybe because he's fictional. Now, I want to stop for a moment about his other narratives as far as people and encounters he had in his stories, and I want to talk about 2 of his methods that he claimed that he used to murder people. Now, he did use cyanide, obviously, on a burger, which is pretty easy. You just put it on food. However, he also claimed that he had a death spray and that he would walk up to people with a syringe and poke them in public or soak their clothes, dropping it on them, and that they would die. And then, of course, there's his man-eating piranha cave rats. So I want to get to those 2 things because those are very memorable stories. Let's go.
Somewhere, and I don't know where, he picked up on cyanide poisoning as being a good way, a good, quick way to kill somebody.
Come on, Dr. Baden. Cyanide's been a very well-known poison since Agatha Christie and the Holocaust, as you mentioned. but it became the most famous poison in the world as far back as the massacre of Jonestown in '78. I've known what cyanide was my entire life. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And during the period in which Richard apparently used cyanide for the first time, feeding it to Gary Smith in a laced hamburger, that was December of '82. Well, the cyanide Tylenol murders were front page headlines from September to October of '82. So everybody at that point knew what cyanide was. It was easily the most famous poison in the world. The cyanide Tylenol murders, and everybody was spooked out and afraid that they were going to get potassium cyanide on their aspirin. They might not have known the difference between potassium cyanide and hydrogen cyanide, but they knew what cyanide was. Now, Richard was probably introduced to cyanide by Robert Pronge. Now, Robert Pronge is the infamous ice cream truck driver, and even though he wasn't a mob hitman, as portrayed in the books on HBO and in the movie, he was still an intelligent, volatile, and dangerous man. Pronge was first in the news back in the early 70s when he was involved in a scandal while attending a college in Alabama. He started making and performing in gay interracial porn using a two-way mirror he built in his dorm, and he was expelled. College let him back for a semester after some legal dispute. So he made and distributed porn, which was a possible link to Richard. He had basic chemistry knowledge and blew off his ex-wife's door after they divorced, and Richard mentioned he had some crazy books. I know The Poor Man's James Bond was a popular book at that time, and it teaches you how to make cyanide, and he could have synthesized some himself and sold it to Kuklinski, who didn't have the basic familiarity with chemistry to make it himself. Pronge was later found with bullets in his head. Could have been Kuklinski after a fallout, or somebody else, who knows.
Richard, I understand that you're an expert in the use of cyanide.
Okay, now that's an exaggeration to say the least. I love how they kiss his ass every second in order to play up to his narcissism so that he'll start boasting and talk. Richard didn't exactly know anything about lethal doses or the onset of symptoms. He was not an expert on the use of cyanide. He used it to kill 2 people, except one he didn't really kill him from the cyanide. He instead had somebody strangle him because he didn't know about lethal doses, and he was afraid it wasn't going to work.
How many times did you kill with it?
1.5, if you count Gary Smith, who technically died from being strangled. It's obvious Richard didn't know what he was doing when he told Deppner to strangle Gary. However, our modest Iceman, of course, is going to take a few, that's probably giving him too much credit, and say,
quite a few.
A quick recap. In real life, he simply had Deppner and Smith ingest it. And after the first time, with Smith, when he didn't wait long enough, again, he had him strangled. The second time, without knowledge of lethal doses, Rich simply poured cyanide all over the food, so this time, Deppner died. Now that's probably why he was out of cyanide, and he didn't know where to look for it or synthesize it, and eventually began shopping around, which would get him in trouble. When this guy asks him how you use cyanide, because, he's a professional at it, notice how vague Richard's answers get, and in one response he fucks up how effective that method would be in using it under the circumstances he gives.
What's the different ways you use cyanide?
You could put it in liquid form. You could, person could say, for instance, a person could be in a bar. You bunk into them, possibly by mistake, or say you were intoxicated, spill the drink on them, and leave. Everybody just looks around, thinks you were drunk, or that you just had an accident or something, and meanwhile, it's soaking through their clothes into their pores and into their system.
If you were to splash cyanide on somebody, especially in a public place, and especially so much of it that it will get through their clothes and their pores, there's a good chance it will be painful upon contact. You see, cyanide irritates your skin, and it hurts. If the symptoms are immediate, then Richard is in trouble, because the person's going to know you just poured something unhealthy for their skin on them, which is causing pain. If it dilutes through their clothes enough, it'll make it even less likely it's sufficient to kill you. The victim is then likely to shout something like, "Hey, that big dumb Bullock poured some acid or poison all over me! Help! Help! Stop the Bullock!" Since everybody in Richard's world knows he's part Polish, I kid. But they are likely to alert people that a large guy just poured something that hurts on them. And they had security cameras back then. They've had security cameras for a while. Between ingestion, breathing, and skin contact, the latter is the least dangerous, though still very dangerous. And you'll start to show signs that could tell you immediately to go to the hospital, like vomiting and heavy breathing, and of course that painful skin contact.
And I happened to be watching these people, and there was a couple of gay people dancing and whatever, and nobody was paying them no mind whatsoever. They were walking anywhere, going anywhere, because people basically don't look at gay people. But the idea came to me, yeah, try gay, but how in the hell am I going to get by? A 300-pound gay man. I mean, you know, that's a little bit far-fetched. So I went to the extreme of far-fetched. I got this loudest costume you'd ever want to see on. I mean, I went full-blown gay person. Of course, maybe the other gay people are going to be pissed off at me, but I'm not saying anything bad about them. But I got this canary yellow sweater and these bright pants, and I got these elevated shoes, which I'm tall to begin with. I got these thin shoes on, and I acted like a full-blown gay person. I mean, and I got on this thing, I'm doing this like dancing bit, and I get onto this thing, and they got these lights, and I hate those lights, by the way, those strobe lights.
If a gay person or a person of any other sexual orientation dressed up like that and danced on stage, I'm pretty sure, having been to New York and in New York dance clubs, anybody would notice his eccentric outfit at 6'5". Yeah, they would notice that. It's a funny image, though, and evidence that Richard's a great storyteller, but it's trivial. Let's go.
Man, I hate those lights. You can't see good with them lights, and it messes up my eyes. So anyway, I'm trying to get close to this guy. I'm doing this crazy thing. I'm acting real swishy. I guess that's what you would call it. And I get up close to this guy, and I bump into him. But everybody's bumping into everybody. And he had a heart attack. Because I had hypothermia. When I bumped into him, I popped him with the needle.
What was in the needle?
In his case, a heart attack.
Okay, I'm not aware of any poison that goes through the circulatory system that quickly to cause an immediate heart attack. And if the person was just stabbed with a needle, they should usually have time to be able to say something, especially with the 6'5" guy there. They should have time to yell. Maybe he had some sea snake venom in it or something that I'm not sure would go through the system that quickly either. Not so quickly that he wouldn't have time to yell and react after just being stabbed by a hypodermic needle. People should have caught that when he said, in his case, a heart attack, he wasn't just joking, he was trying to evade the question. But let's use Kuklinski's favorite poison, cyanide, which is one of the deadliest on the planet, and which he preferred. That's probably what he was thinking of when he said that, because that's what he was always saying was his favorite poison. So what would happen if you stabbed somebody in the back or the leg like that with a hypodermic needle with a lethal amount of cyanide? Okay, well, check this out.
His mother couldn't fight back the tears, telling the jury what happened Valentine's Day 2017. She says she was at home waiting for Tran to get there. There was a bang at the door, and a voice said, "Mom, Mom, open the door." Video cameras from Tran's Virginia Beach home captured Lee coming outside, her daughter hobbling around on one leg. Prosecutors showed the whole video from the time that Tran arrived from home and got out of the car. They say you can see Joseph Merlino running up to Tran and inject cyanide into the leg. Tran was unconscious 15 minutes later. By midnight, she was brain dead and died by 5 the next day.
That's a horrific story, and I feel sorry for the girl. But it's a good example of how cyanide doesn't work immediately when you use a hypodermic needle. So his method of using a hypodermic needle, some kind of poison, probably cyanide as he imagines it, causing immediate death, sounds like more lies from our 300-pound bullshit artist, Mr. Richard Kuklinski, a.k.a. our Polish Rambo. If you want someone to die immediately, hydrogen cyanide is the most lethal in its gaseous form. That might cause somebody to die immediately if it's concentrated heavy enough. And that's where Richard's most ridiculous story of his various methods of using cyanide comes in. His made-up weapon, the nasal death spray. Now, as far as Richard's death spray goes, the one that he claims causes immediate death, first he kind of suggests that he used hydrogen cyanide in a gas form through a nasal spray, and that it would cause instant death. Well, that's possible that it could cause instant death, sure, because that's the most dangerous form. But that would take some serious James Bond technology to have a device that converts a liquid into a gas through a nasal spray. And if you did that, and it was that concentrated, it would be just as likely to kill you. Now, in Philip Carlo's Iceman, he claims it was liquid with dimethyl sulfixide, which makes it more easy to get through the skin. Okay, but again, if you're not ingesting it, it's painful. And especially painful if it hits your eyes. That would cause somebody to scream. Now, you don't believe me that liquid takes a while, at least a few seconds, enough for you to be able to exclaim, "Hey, that guy just sprayed me! Ah!" Well, let's check this guy out. He was a war criminal. I don't know the details of that war very well. I was around during that time, but I'm sure he was a bad person. However, check this out. How long does it take for him to die after he just drinks a buttload of cyanide? Not very long. Definitely a useful way to go out if you're wanting to really piss off your enemies. But it still takes enough time for him to be able to shout whatever he wants.
Stop, please. Please sit down. I have taken poison.
That guy quickly died, but not before he could say, "I have taken some poison," and was led away from the courtroom. And so I'm going to let you watch him be led away to his death that he inflicted upon himself. And you can see that although cyanide does kill you incredibly quick, and you're doomed once you take it, unless you're right there at a hospital, but it isn't an effective poison if you want to kill somebody before they can respond and identify you. So that should be in itself sufficient to show you that Richard Kuklinski didn't use the death spray or these hypodermic needles. He just fed them to his lackeys on a hamburger with cyanide salts. And one case, he didn't know what the lethal dose was. In the other case, it seems like he used up the rest of his cyanide to make sure this one died. Now, let's move on. In another one of Richard's delusions, he claims that he attached a bomb to a remote-control car and had it driving around until it went the proper way and exploded, killing somebody. He must have worked for DARPA and the CIA when he wasn't working for the mob, or maybe the League of Shadows and Ra's al Ghul. Now, if it was a heavy bomb, the car wouldn't go anywhere. And if you used a small bomb, well, that's a pretty sophisticated technology. And it's just as likely to explode on him if he's not careful as it would anybody. So he had some kind of professional, highly skilled bomb-making ability. Huh. never mentioned that when they talked during the interview. Since there are no newspaper accounts of anybody sending remote control cars after targets, causing them to explode, particularly contemporary to his day, let's go with a second alternative. Maybe Richie was watching too many movies and he decided to tell these stories based off movies and create his own little stories out of them. They're highly entertaining, but he was trolling you when he made them. Now it's time to shit on Richie's rat story. This was my favorite part of his nonsense, his little fairy tales, and it was also fun to make in the documentary.
In his sessions with psychiatrist Dr. Dietz, he revealed that some of his clients wanted his victims to suffer before they died. Of course, Kuklinski obliged, creating the kind of death nightmares are made of.
Not just nightmares, but also financially successful pieces of entertainment, like this HBO special.
Often capturing the torture on film.
Hey, that's a good idea. You're making the cops' job easier. Torture and murder somebody in the first degree, and film it. Nothing can go wrong there. Well, maybe you just tortured somebody once and filmed it. Wait, did she say he often filmed himself torturing victims? Seems like an unnecessary risk. Our criminal mastermind here could have just tortured his victim in front of his sadistic boss, but I guess his boss needed a tape as a kind of revenge memory for him to whack off to on occasion. And Kuklinski, being a trusting guy, didn't have to worry about any of the homes of these sick fucks getting raided someday by the cops, one of his family members finding it, blabbering away, and implementing Rich in another murder. Leaving evidence around seems stupid, but it's not like serial killers don't take trophies, or people don't do stupid things all the time when they murder. It's just kind of trusting leaving all these tapes with these different bosses. Maybe he burned them later on. But anyway, so what was this diabolical nightmare that Richard did?
I used to have a thing where I would take somebody into a cabin or cave, whatever you want to call it, and I would tie them up or tape them, their hands and their feet together, and then I would leave them there.
Jesus fucking Christ, that would suck. Especially if I have to take a leak. I know HBO shows you a cave that looks like it's straight out of Evil Dead, if one of those movies had a cave in it, and that's to suggest that that's the cave he took his victims to. But like a lot of images it shows in these HBO specials, they aren't linked to anything Richard actually did, and are just there to create atmosphere. That's why it's also in black and white, because it looks scarier. Fortunately, though, Richard identified the caves he'd torture and film his victims in the book Iceman by Philip Karl. He interviewed him in prison. Richard identifies these caves as Bucks County, Pennsylvania caves. They're surrounded by forests. Now this is diabolical because although the very large caves are rare, very rare, the average small cave might be the size of a room or a basement, and it's surrounded by forest. So this sinister Richard could be putting me in there for a few days. I'm just stuck having to wait to get out. Even if I get out, you put me in one, I'm not going to know where to go. Even if I somehow get free, I'm going to be wandering in the forest all night. Might as well just stay there. So if I were the victim, that means this mean motherfucker is going to leave me in the dark all night, tied up, till some splunker finds me. It's got to be cold.
And I leave a camera on.
Plus, he's taping it so his Cobra Commander boss can maniacally giggle at me, watching it on film. That's embarrassing. Well, at least he's not going to do anything worse than that. Oh, fuck. No, he has more to tell us. Hope it's not anything too diabolical.
And rats used to eat them.
Oh God, no. Jesus, how could you, Rich? Not the man-eating piranha cave rats. They almost took out Rambo once.
Just used to kill these people and start nibbling away at them.
Iceman, you also say they were quickly stripped down to the bone, most like how people used to describe piranha when they'd eat something. That they became mythologized to this point that they would just be able to completely consume somebody really quick. Well, I hope no explorers go missing because you've repeatedly introduced them to human flesh as part of their diet, but I haven't read about any. So what kind of human-eating species were these rats? And what were they doing in a cave if they liked meat that much? Seems like you'd get meat somewhere else. How'd they evolve that way?
These guys watch too many movies.
Well, in Iceman, at the very beginning, Richard says they were Norway rats. Basically, your common sewer rat, also known as the brown rat, the kind that invade Taco Bell and infest it at 4 a.m. in the morning whenever the meats got out. But do hordes of brown rats ever gather together and attack and eat people like that, quickly devouring them down to the bone and even crawling off with the bone? There's something sketchy about that. If that were true, wouldn't New York City be gone by now? I mean, it'd be kind of terrifying place. Let's see. Now, the book Iceman quickly jumps ahead to invite its readers to see how dangerous Iceman could be when it describes his first brown piranha cave rat torture. Starting on page 5, Roy DeMeo, whose philosophy was no body, no crime, and kill the victim as quickly as possible, and if they have to be tortured, it would be done in Canarsie or Flatlands, and he'd do it himself, sometimes with multiple killers, for some reason has faith in this big Pollock. Also, all his inner crew work for free as a job requirement, but for some reason, Kuklinski claims that he was Roy's secret weapon, whatever that means. Anyway, instead he uses Iceman. And he illogically decides to pay Iceman because Roy doesn't care about money suddenly. So this employer is going to give Richard $10,000 for killing him and $20,000 for the suffering. Who knows how much Roy got, but I'm sure this $20,000 was a substantial amount of it, and that's going to Iceman. Clearly, not only did DeMeo suddenly not like money, he also forgot how to kill himself. Something, as a serial killer who saw his numbers like an athletic record, he was always trying to kill more and more people so he would have killed the most. It doesn't seem to make much sense. He'd want Richard, who he has no reason to think is better at it than himself, go do it. Finally, he forgot he did have more competent killers who could get the job done in New Jersey and have the body vanish at Fountain Avenue or one of the New York City or New Jersey local junkyards where they had incinerators. Instead, Roy just assumes Richard is telling the truth about his brown piranha cave rats and lets him go kidnap the victim. And he does so, this Richard, in broad daylight with a .357 Magnum that would make a lot of noise if the victim decided to resist. Then he drives the victim, Iceman does, 300 miles so he can feed them to his pet rats. They're always eager to see their master. They miss him. And Roy presumed that these pet rats would an effective disposal system. He usually tested them, but, you know, pet rats, everybody knows that those things work. The only thing Roy loved more than money was murdering people, which is why he only offered $11,000 to hit a guy named Mikey Muscles. Now that's a detail you can find if you'd go read Capicci's Murder Machine, which is far better than the Iceman book. DeMeo was far more fascinating. That hit will also be described further in my own book, which I'm writing on DeMeo, and his crew and the police who helped bring him down. But in this instance, if Iceman was true, the one thing I could think of is maybe this no-named guy contracting the hit offered a lot more money to Roy, but said he would only do it if Roy used a big Pollock who had an army of man-eating rats at his command. That would disqualify Roy or his crew from being able to do the hit, and leave Roy with no choice but to pay Richard, probably the only guy to dominate rats since the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Once Richard gets there to Bucks County, he's driven all the way there, hasn't gotten caught yet. He ties the victim up and leaves him alone for 2 days, something that Roy would have killed anybody for, since the victim might escape if you just leave him there. And he films him being eaten by his giant rats, again, and then he takes the tapes and drives this 300 miles back, which is evidence that Roy would not want him carrying around. And then, on top of that, he has a blabbermouth doing it. Richard would someday tell Olafroni, the cop who would arrest him, within a few days after meeting him, that he was a contract killer, and a blabbermouth who bragged constantly. Roy himself, he couldn't stand anybody bragging around him. It would make him pissed. He'd cut you up for it if he really didn't like you. Richard, as I mentioned earlier, just left that tape of him torturing somebody alive. Roy's not going to be happy with that. Richard would have been killed in a day. But I guess if you have an army of superhuman rats, that might intimidate Roy a little bit. Now, for some other incidences in which he did this in Bucks County, and it progressively, the rats get more and more out of control and bigger, or at least there's more of them, and now they're eating the bones even. On page 8, he's left this poor son of a bitch screaming and begging, and he's come back 4 days later, and there's nothing but a skeleton. It's a nod. Same again on page 192, nothing but a nod skeleton. And this time it's only been 2 days. On page 228, he returns, and the rats even took the bones and left nothing but a stain. Yes, at that point, there were even more rats, or they mutated into larger rats in their ravenous flesh-eating stage. Now, later in the book, Sammy the Bull has now hired Richard, because he's basically forgotten how to kill himself, or even rely on competent killers, and he's decided Iceman's going to go drive a few hundred miles away with his victim, which leads to a lot of risk, to feed him to his enormous, thankful pet rats, whom by now must be in the millions. And somehow they still haven't starved to death. They're just sitting in a fucking cave, waiting for Richard to feed them something. Where are these goddamn things going and getting that much meat if there's that many that they can strip them down to the bones that quickly? Now, are there even examples of brown rats doing something like this? Richard describes this terrible cave, opening from granite, where deep inside it would go so far back it would become pitch, be able to hear these ravenous rats. So this is the area he claimed he would feed his victims to rats. Rats that were so deadly as to be literally legendary. He dropped meat in front of the caves, and these gnawing and crawling, scampering brown beasts would descend, always famished, to carry away the meat in their horrific horde. The part about rats crawling over and eating hamburger, that's not too unbelievable. That rats, which are omnivores, rushed out in throngs from a cave every time he would go there and put hamburger there, sounds like he was playing a little bit too much Dungeons and Dragons. You see, rats that are that hungry and that many, they wouldn't sit in a cave. Again, they would migrate to more plentiful areas. And, of course, Rich never revealed the location to his den of wicked Mighty Mouse chaos, even though he couldn't shut his fucking mouth about everything else. And that's a red flag, because, the cave's obvious bullshit if he can't say anything about where it's at. So this brings me to my next point. Richard Kranzel is a specialist on Bucks County caves, writes for the National Speleological Cave Society, has never even heard of this legendary den of horror. And if you don't know what speleological means, which is not easy to pronounce, I struggle all the time, it's the study of caves. He said Durham is the largest Bucks County cave, and like I pointed out earlier, Bucks County is otherwise not known for enormous caves like that. He points out there are a lot of tourists, spelunkers who go there. Nobody's seen any evidence of skeletons. This is not a place, an area, where nobody in the last 50 years would have not noticed a cave that large. Sure, there are some instances of brown rats invading some caves in the world as an invasive species, such as Hawaii. But that was because the caves were near human settlements, the rats were able to follow human waste, and they didn't permanently remain in those caves. They would return to areas with more food, like the human settlements, or towns or cities, and it just created a pattern of migration during certain periods. Now, brown rats are the ultimate scavengers and omnivores more than predators. They started in Southeast Asia over 100,000 years ago and followed humans, especially with the expansion of civilizations, exploration, and conquering. The most of their near domination of the Earth, which they have kind of dominated the Earth at this point, happened in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. So, even in those instances where you might find some brown rats some of the time in some places on the planet, that's not at Bucks County, where they have not been seen. Now, let's see what the evidence is of brown rats devouring people in just a few days, until they were skeletons. Unless Richie was a liar, there should be some evidence of prehistoric, piranha-like behavior among basic subway rats. Alright, historically we have rat torture. During the Renaissance, some torturers placed containers with rats over a person's exposed stomach. The human victim was restrained, couldn't do anything about it. The container was heated up, and the rats would desperately try to gnaw their way out of the victim because they had nowhere else to go. There were variants of this practiced by South American dictators during the 20th century. That's useless if that's an example, because if something's suffering or threatened enough, anything can act outside its nature in order to escape pain and fear. Nor were there any records of these rats burrowing through the human torture victim like some kind of drill, with the cartoonish and ravenous effectiveness described in Philip Carlo's Iceman, which is basically fiction. Sorry, you watch too many movies if you believe that. The only other examples I could find were some very sick and impoverished, usually homeless people and drug addicts who had severe abrasions due to nips from rats, and where a baby died in horrific instance. I don't want to detail, but the rats attacked very vulnerable places. Enough said about that, because I'm trying to keep this show as light as I can for such a dark subject. But in both those cases where the rat infestation was very severe, nothing happened like Richard explained, where they're running off with bones. It's like something out of a dark Disney cartoon, ironically enough. And even if they were cartoonishly that aggressive, take a lot of them to consume all the way down to that. If they're that hungry, what the hell are they doing in a cave where prey is sparse? So there aren't really any examples of people being eaten alive by starving rats. And that's because starving rats don't eat people alive. New York City wouldn't have any people if they did. But none of this matters, because what's most ironic is Bucks County caves don't even have brown rats. Rats in Bucks County cave are the shy Allegheny wood rat. They're herbivores. They eat nuts and berries. And there aren't very many of them.
Hi, I'm Mario, the Game Commission's North Central Regional Wildlife Diversity Biologist. Today, I want to take you along with me as I go into some remote habitat in search of the state-threatened Allegheny wood rat. Also known as the rock rat, this small rock-dwelling mammal loves a room with a view, living in steep mountainside rock outcrops surrounded by deciduous forest. Fortunately, wood rats leave us little clues alerting us to their presence. Adult females typically occupy a primary den site well hidden deep within the rock. Entrances to nests are often lined with dry leaves and twigs that serve as an alarm system if something approaches. Because this pack rat caches food items for winter, we can search for fungi and herbaceous plants packaged into small bundles tucked away in rock runways and small crevices.
Rich encountered any cave rats there. He spotted that rat might have thought it was the brown rat, and was inspired by 70s and 80s films about carnivorous rats. That was an era of monster films. If anything, this tells us Rich was a fan of horror and action films, contemporary with the times. He should have been working as a scriptwriter in Hollywood. He would have actually made more money than he ever did as a burglar and killer. He had real talent for it. And I'm actually serious about that. I'm not making fun of him. He really did have talent. Alright, that concludes the rat nonsense. No, there was no piranha cave rats in Bucks County. He also claims that there were caves there that are so large. There's only one large cave there, but that there were caves so large he could throw bodies down there and you wouldn't hear the body hit the ground. Jesus, what's he talking about? Oh yeah, he's just making it up because most people don't go to Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That concludes this story. I'll continue with part 2 very soon. I have it almost completely done, and there I will be debunking Rich's out-of-control fantasies, in which he claimed he joined the DeMeo crew. That can be proved wrong, and I can prove that he didn't murder Roy, Galante, Paul Castellano, Pete Calabro, or Hoffa. And yeah, he did say he murdered Hoffa. He increasingly became bolder with his lies, but his fans didn't follow carefully. He would have claimed that he killed JFK too if you had given him enough time, and I can only imagine if he was free now. Yeah, the Mafia paid me to kill Osama. That was right after I did 9/11 for Osama. I work for both the government and the terrorists. That's how I make 6 figures. Anyway, usually I end on a dramatic note, but not for this series, at least not until the very end of it. Take care. Oh, yeah, and make sure you're on the lookout for part 2. That'll conclude the series. I'm not going to be making this long like I do the DeMeo series.